You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and 24/7 Sports, powered by Overtime Media. I'm your host, Chad Jensen. With me, as always, is your Denver Broncos reporter for 24/7 Sports. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, we're recording this episode Wednesday evening. Kind of a busy day for the Broncos in that we got clarity on Darian Stewart. He's out. We found out the Broncos aren't going to tender Brian Parker. And Chad Kelly might find himself in the slammer like MC Hammer.
That's right. He's facing up to 3 years if he's convicted on felony trespassing charges. He pleaded not guilty to that, so his next court appearance is in April. Well, I'll see what happens with him. Darian Stewart, obviously, Chad, you and I both agree, wasn't surprising. That was always an ex-Broncos cut there, looking to get younger, more aggressive, faster on defense, so no-brainer there. And free agency is right around the corner. The Broncos are going to be very aggressive. It's the calm before the storm right now.
Yeah. One thing I want to say, a little tribute to Darian Stewart, is that, you know, even though his play fell off a cliff this past season, I mean, he wasn't great in 2017, but he wasn't the liability that he kind of became this past season. But one thing I'll say about him is that his 2015 campaign, in which he ended up going to the Pro Bowl, his one and only Pro Bowl on his resume, was excellent, and especially his performance in both the AFC Championship game and the Super Bowl, Super Bowl 50, as a physical enforcer, just hitting dudes, laying wood over the middle. I can remember him completely trucking Danny Amendola, several Panthers. I mean, everyone that season in the playoffs was afraid to go over the middle. And yeah, TJ Ward played somewhat of a factor in that, but mostly receivers, tight ends, they were ducking Darian Stewart. So happy trails to the man.
Yeah, I'll say this about Stewart. He was good in 2015. He was serviceable in 2016. He was bad in 2017. And he was god-awful in 2018. He really fell off a cliff. And in 2017, it happened in that Raiders game when Johnny Holton burned him straight down the sideline, long pass from Derek Carr. And I knew that Stewart was losing a step there. And last year, when you saw him next to a younger player like Justin Simmons, he clearly lost a step. The Broncos have to get younger.
We got a lot to get to today, including a great guest who's going to give us some insight on the buzz coming out of the Combine and what to expect in free agency, which is coming just next week. I mean, the NFL calendar comes quicker than you really think sometimes, at least for those of us covering this thing.
There is no offseason.
That's right. There really isn't for us. Sometimes when I talk to people, Zach, just a quick aside, on the street or people I meet and they ask what I do and I tell them and they go, "What do you talk about in the off season?" It's like, dude, you have no idea. That's when things really get interesting.
There's more going on in the off season than the regular season.
Honestly, this job is more fun in the off season than it is during football.
That's right. We have pockets of time off, but other than that, it's a year-round job, and we love it.
Yep, we really do. It becomes almost like an addiction. You know, you got to Jones, you got to feed the beast. So anyway, we got a lot to get to. Real quick, couple matters of business. You guys have kicked butt leaving your creative reviews and rating the show on iTunes. We are officially up and into the triple digits, but we can't stop there. So if you have not taken the time to leave a creative review, give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, please take the time, get that done. It helps us to grow, helps us to reach new listeners, and it also allows us to beat the competition in terms of rankings. You know, there's multiple Broncos podcasts out there that you could be listening to. You choose to listen to the Huddle Up podcast, and there's fans just like you that we need to reach in that same sense. And by leaving your reviews and rating the show positively, it helps us reach them. So take care of that. Also follow the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. All right, now joining us on the Overtime Hotline is none other than Benjamin Allbright. You guys know him, you love him as he's your NFL insider in Broncos country, let's face it, and he's joining us today to dish on some buzz on the Combine, look ahead a little bit at free agency. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing all right. About yourselves?
We're hanging in there. Man. We're still kind of combing through some of the buzz, some of the implications that have come out of the Combine, and we wanted to talk to you about what we saw there. Now, it was kind of fun to get a chance to see some of these quarterbacks up close, some of the linebackers, some of the need positions, we know the Broncos are dealing with at this point. But What have you heard as far as, a single prospect or multiple prospects that did the most at the Combine to maybe intrigue the Broncos, get them to kind of go back to the tape a little maybe and reshuffle their priorities?
Well, I think the Broncos are just trying to give themselves flexibility. I think they're out there looking at, what's available. They understand that they're going to be reactive in this draft because they're picking cats. And so I think that what they're trying to do is give themselves flexibility. They don't know who's going to be taken ahead of them. They don't know what's going to be available at their pick. So I think that everything that they've done so far, trading for Flacco, all these kinds of things, is just an effort to provide themselves with the best attempt at building the best roster that they can, and not forcing them into a square peg, round hole scenario at 10.
Ben, now every single offensive lineman, it seemed like, that I talked to at the Combine said they met with or already met with the Broncos. Obviously, that's a dire need for them. They have, center, right tackle issues. Do you think that's a possibility, even a dark horse possibility for Denver, going offensive line number 10?
I don't think they're going to go with one at 10, no. That would be an extreme dark horse in that scenario. I think it's more likely that if they do go offensive line, it'll be significantly later in the draft. I would suggest that they're going to look through free agency. We talked about this before last time I was on. I don't think Paradis is coming back. I think he's going to be priced out of the market. I'm going to move McGovern to center, and I think that that's really going to open up that right guard position. And then they'll look for somebody there in free agency. I would suggest Foster for Pittsburgh, maybe a guy they look at. He fits the scheme. There's a relationship with Munchak. He's been a left guard, most of his career, but Ron Leary's played both sides, so that that's not really an issue. I think that if they're looking at offensive line, it would probably be a depth guy and probably be later.
You're one of the guys that kind of got me to go back and reevaluate my take on Kyler Murray. I mean, you've been pretty strong take that he's not worth. Basically, at least for the Broncos anyway, he's not worth a top 10 pick, and I think you've been pretty clear on that on Twitter. It seems like his height is just that alone is a non-starter for John Elway. I mean, Elway talked a lot about height again at the Combine. I mean, it's something that's clearly high on the priority list when he's looking for that prototype. Is he even in the conversation at Dove Valley, Kyler Murray, and do you think... We know that Elway, I guess, Josh Rosen kind of rubbed the Broncos wrong in meetings last year. Could that even be an option for the Broncos if, in fact, the Cardinals put Rosen on the market?
Well, I don't think so. I would say that that would be about a 0.0% chance of happening. The Broncos had a chance at Josh Rosen free and clear last year at 5. He wasn't on their board to do that. If Bradley Chubb had not been there, they would have traded back with the Buffalo Bills. And to be honest with you, Josh Rosen wasn't even the Cardinals' number one choice. They were after Josh Allen. So, I think that that's not a possibility for Denver. Either one of those, Kyler Murray or Josh Rosen, are not possibilities for the Broncos.
What was it, just real quick, while we're on the topic of Rosen, just real quick, what was it that turned the Broncos off so strongly from Josh Rosen?
I don't want to get too much into specifics there, but they had him in, took a look at him, and he was not their guy, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, fair enough.
Ben, speaking of quarterbacks that turned off the Broncos, Case Keenum, one thing Elway told us at the Combine was that he's welcoming him back as a backup at a reduced rate. But the common logic seems to think that they would trade him or release him. Do you think with March 13th, right around the corner next week, do you think it's possible they keep him on the roster as Flacco's backup, or will he be, receiving his pink slip?
I think he's going to be traded. I think he's going to be traded to the Cardinals. They may end up releasing him outright, but I think he's going to be traded. They would like the cap relief, and trading him would do that. I don't think he'll be around. I know they said they'd love to have him around, and of course, I guess they'd love to have more talent and competition, stuff like that, and get him to take a pay cut. But I really don't think that's going to happen. I think Case is a little put off by the way the situation unfolded. I think he thought that he was going to get another year, and I think rightfully so. I think he was a little upset that they ran an offense that was tailored to the exact opposite of what his skill set is, and he felt like bringing Scangarello in was going to be something that kind of more fit what he does. Case has always been successful as more of a boot action quarterback. And so he felt like that this was, this offense was going to be tailor-made for him, and then they went in a different direction at quarterback. So, he was a little put off by that. I don't think that he's going to be sticking around.
Ben, we've theorized on the show here that Mike Kliss's tweet that the Broncos are unlikely to take a quarterback at pick 10 is a little bit of a smokescreen. What's your take on that for our listeners as far as, are the Broncos at this point coming out of the Combine, big event in terms of its meaning for the pre-draft process? They come out, next thing you know, the mouthpiece is saying Broncos unlikely. Is that a smokescreen, or do you think there's any truth to that?
I don't think that I don't think it's a smoke screen per se, and I don't think Mike Kliss is out here smoke screening anybody. I don't think he's the type of person you would want to do that for you. I think Mike's out there, maybe repeating company line, whether that's, true or false. I think that the Broncos are still in play at 10 with a quarterback. I don't think that that's out of the picture. I would just suggest that, a lot of free agency needs to happen first, and certain things in free agency would need to fall into place in order to make that work. This is a team that is dreadfully thin at corner right now. They need to nail down that strong safety position, obviously going after Amos, but we'll see how that works. They need to nail down that nose tackle position. That's going to be Jonathan Hankins if they can make that work. So they need to get some athletic inside linebackers, a tight end, the guard. So there's holes on this roster that they need to fill. And, there's going to be premium players available at 10 to potentially do that. So, it really becomes a situation of who's available and what falls into their lap. If all the premium talent at positions that they need to fill is gone, well, then yeah, Drew Lock, a guy they like, would definitely be in play there. I would not say he's a primary target. I would not suggest that they're even thinking like that right. I would suggest that their focus is on free agency, fixing the roster holes that they have to field a competitive team, and then maybe looking toward the future with an eye toward the future once the draft starts rolling around.
You're a big QB guy, and I really especially respect your analysis on quarterbacks. What do you think of Locke at the Combine, his throwing and all that?
I thought he threw pretty well. He's definitely got the strongest arm. He's got more athleticism than people thought he did, which is good. I would say that he's, outside of Kyler Murray, he's probably the most athletic, strongest arm quarterback in the class. I don't think that he's a day one starter. I think he's a guy who probably needs a year to groom him. There's some mechanical issues. He has a penchant for throwing off his back foot. But, overall, I think that this idea that he's, that he's a future bust or whatever, I think that's silly. I think that most of the stuff that's wrong with him is coachable. Just, need a year to kind of iron him out. I think his upside and his ceiling are higher than Dwayne Haskins, but I think Haskins is better right now and is probably, QB1 as far as being ready to start day one.
Ben, shifting gears away from the quarterback, free agency is right around the corner. You alluded to it. The Broncos have a ton of holes. Is there any one player who they're going to be calling up immediately when that tampering window opens? I happen to think it's, Adrian Amos, but anything you heard on that front?
I would suggest that if you think they're waiting for waiting to make these calls and haven't started doing that already, that would be a naive train of thought. Yes, Amos and Jonathan Hankins are guys that that you're definitely going to be looking at right off the bat. I think that if C.J. Mosley, balks and the Ravens try to lowball him, that would be in play. At inside linebacker, they're still going to be looking for guys there. You've got a couple of guys on this roster that, Marshall's going to be gone. You've got Todd Davis, who's a downhill only inside linebacker. You got Josie Jewell, who's a run funnel guy, and you need side to side backers. So, that's really going to be a focus because, a lot of the scheme is dependent on athletic, instinctive linebackers, the inside linebacker position. If you go back and look at, Fangio's defenses historically, it starts with a massive run stuffer at the nose, a massive zero tech, and instinctive athletic inside linebackers. And then they fill in with talent around that. And so, I think that's really going to be the direction they're looking.
Do you think there's any chance Ed Oliver slips to pick 10?
there's some rumors that he can fall farther than that. And I could definitely see that. There's some people think that he's a tweener. Some people think he doesn't have a position. Some people think there's some personality quirks. There's a lot of different things surrounding that. And I would suggest that, while we've all been high on him and people kind of fall into that collective consensus mentality, that there are, people who have to invest millions of dollars into these individuals, maybe have some reservations on him that, the average person doesn't see. So he could be there. I don't think he would be a player the Broncos would be interested in. I don't think that he's a guy that really fits what they want to do. I would suggest to look at the Byron Murphy is really the name to look at 10. I would suggest that's the big name. One of the other things about Fangio's scheme that it's really dependent on corners that can not only cover and have short area quickness, but can tackle and will hit. And so that kind of rules out, a Greedy Williams who's, let's be charitable and say allergic to tackling, versus a guy like DeAndre Baker who maybe hurt himself with that slow 40, even though Mel Tucker's been kind of talking him up. So, I would suggest Byron Murphy's a name to really keep an eye on and put in the mix. That's the one name I've not heard people mention there at 10 that I think is really, really in the mix there.
I've got one more for you, Ben. It's back to the quarterback talk. Let's just say the Broncos don't go quarterback at pick 10, or the guy that they maybe would have considered at pick 10 as a quarterback is off the board. We talked to Jarrett Stidham, guys like Will Grier, Gardner Minshew, Brett Rippon. At the Combine, they'd all met with the Broncos. Which of that group, or even someone I haven't mentioned, could you see as probably the likeliest candidate to end up hearing their name called later on in the draft, maybe day 2, early day 3 by the Broncos?
So I would say Stidham is probably that guy. His tape was not great, but talking to people, after talking to people from the Senior Bowl and in the post season circuit, his name keeps coming up more and more. People like him; they like talking to him. He's a guy that doesn't necessarily need football. His fiance's dad is president of the Houston Rockets, but so he's a guy that loves it. He's out there because he loves it. He was playing in an offense that's not really suited for developing NFL talent. We've seen quarterbacks that looked bad in that offense, go on to have some success. We've seen quarterbacks that look good in that offense go on to have some success. Cam Newton, for instance. But now Stidham's game is completely different than Newton's. People believe that he's intelligent and then could have a long career, as a backup journeyman with start ability. So I would suggest he would be the name. Other guys to look at, Easton Stick might be a guy. Drew Anderson, I think, is a deep sleeper. Not enough people are talking about out of Murray State. He was the guy who was actually at Buffalo ahead of Tyree Jackson, and then they switched to Tyree, even though Drew was the better passer because Tyree was a superior athlete, and Drew, outplayed him. So just a thought there. But I would suggest those are the names to look at.
I was just going to say what your estimation is the Broncos going QB at 10, if you had to put a percentage on it.
If Byron Murphy isn't there, and they fill in corner, inside linebacker, strong safety, and defensive tackle and right guard in free agency, I would say it's a lock, all pun intended. If they don't get a lot of those, and if they come out of free agency, second wave, third wave of free agency with some pretty glaring holes still, I would suggest it's less likely.
Gotcha.
Excellent. Well, once again, Ben, thanks for joining us on the show. You guys, you can find him on TV. You can find him on the radio. You follow him on Twitter, @Allbright NFL. Ben, thanks again for joining us.
Oh, no problem. Anytime.
All right, so we still got a lot to get to. We're going to come back. We're going to react to our conversation with Ben Albright, but first we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, so an illuminating conversation with our friend Benjamin Allbright, who has been really great in terms of making himself available whenever I've asked him to appear on this show, and I know the same goes for when Nick and Carl have asked him to appear on Building the Broncos. But, other than my opening question about if there was an individual prospect that, added any additional intrigue for the Broncos coming out of the Combine, I thought he was pretty illuminating, especially as it relates to, what the plan is or how the priority deck has been shuffled for the Broncos. Right now, even though we just had the Combine, and you and I, it's almost, we're getting intoxicated by this pre-draft process. The focus right now for the Broncos is free agency.
Yeah, and people, that's the pulse that I get from Broncos country right now is the draft is more important and it's more exciting for them. But, free agency is also the big signing period where the Broncos are going to add a lot of talent to the roster, get rid of a lot of talent. They're going to make a lot of moves starting next week, and they have a lot of holes to fill. And I tend to agree with what Ben said is that they're going to set themselves up in the draft to take the best player available, which is what Fangio and Elway both said at the Combine. They have so many needs to fill, and they're only going to go one position if they get those other needs addressed. For instance, quarterback. If they get guard, tackle, safety, cornerback, if they get those needs fixed in free agency, then the Broncos can leave themselves open to taking Locke, maybe even trading up for him, or maybe even Haskins. We'll see what happens there. I just tend to agree with the plan that the Broncos have, and based on what Ben has heard, it's nice that it aligns with what I thought.
I'm glad that he mentioned the Byron Murphy thing because that's something that we had heard behind the scenes at Mile High Huddle from people, and we had kind of kept it under wraps just on the VIP forums for our subscribers. So I'm glad that he aired that laundry. The Broncos really like Byron Murphy. He's a just under 5'11" corner from Washington. I've seen him play in person multiple times, and he's just one of those guys. He's very similar. Now, he's not as tall, but to me, he reminds me a lot of Aqib Talib because he's just a guy that has a nose for the ball and a nose for the action. He's really good at baiting quarterbacks, and I think, honestly, I talked to Nick about the on-field testing at the Combine, and a lot of the cornerbacks disappointed people, but Byron Murphy was one of the few that really stood out, so he's one guy to keep in mind. You notice in our whole conversation with Ben, we didn't ask him directly, but he mentioned several prospects for that 10th overall pick. One name he didn't really bring up was Devin White.
He might expect White to be off the board. A lot of rumors that the Bucs liked him, and with his combine performance, he shot up his stock. So, one thing to keep in mind about corners, though, I've been asked a lot on Twitter and on Facebook about Greedy Williams. He's really not in consideration based on what Fangio said and what Ben alluded to, in the fact that he can't really tackle that well. He's allergic to tackling, to quote Ben. And Fangio, it's a non-negotiable trade for him. So you can take Greedy Williams off the Broncos draft board. And I also think corner. I've been saying this for a while now. That's another sneaky first-round pick. They talk about Devin White, talk about the quarterbacks, but they need a guy who can cover a passer. They only have Chris Harris Jr. right now with Yotman surgery, Roby to free agency, but I don't think it's going to be Greedy. I like Byron Murphy. I'm a bigger fan, though, overall of DeAndre Baker. Between the two, though, if Locke is off the board, if White is off the board, you could go worse than one of those two corners.
It was interesting also, and I agree with you on that point, it was interesting for him to hear him say, Ben, that Ed Oliver might slip even farther than pick 10, which is the first time I've really heard someone vocalize that, say that, which is surprising to me. And a lot of it has to do, and at the Combine, there were questions about his sideline spats. He got into an argument, I think it was with his head coach, which was very heated and public and televised and all this stuff, and he had to address it. So there are some character issues there, and then you go to the football aspect where, he's being asked by the media, so he's probably getting asked by the NFL too, certain teams, about standing up and playing linebacker, and he basically said that, look, I'll play, if I'm getting paid to play linebacker, then y'all are going to get a linebacker. But he's big enough that I think I would be okay with him at pick 10. If I'm weighing it, I'm not sure if I'd want Ed Oliver or Byron Murphy, but I'd probably want Ed Oliver in terms of immediate impact, even though defensive line, because at this point, this is assuming Drew Lock off the board, Devin White off the board. So if I'm looking at Byron Murphy or Ed Oliver, because Oliver's still on the board there too, I would prefer Ed Oliver, all due respect to Ben Albright. As much as I like Byron Murphy a lot, I would prefer Ed Oliver there because I think he's one of the elite players of this class.
There's always that one tumbler in every draft, that one prospect who falls. Look at Rosen last year, falling to the Cardinals. It could happen with Oliver. I don't really think I would go defensive line, though, if I had a choice, because the Broncos literally don't have any corners right now. They have Chris Harris Jr., who's coming off a fractured fibula, and literally no one else behind him. So Oliver's a great player. He would fit in the scheme, no doubt. If given a choice, I got to take the corner there, based solely on need, even if they want to look to avoid that, going that specific route.
Right. So one thing to keep in mind, he's 6'3" and 292, something like that. I think he might have checked in a little bit lighter than that at the Combine. I can't be sure on that, but compare him to Aaron Donald. Donald was 6'1" going into the draft, still is obviously, but 6'1" as a prospect, 285. He slipped all the way to pick 13. Now, if the league would have known then what they know now about Donald, in 2014, I can't remember who, I think it was Jadeveon Clowney was number 1 that year, but he probably would have gone before Clowney if the league knew then what they know now. And I think Ed Oliver is a player that has that similar type of upside. In fact, even though I'm not one of those, I don't consider myself a draft expert as in the same way that Nick, Carl, Eric, those guys are. But Aaron Donald was one guy I got right. I was on record of saying he's the one guy in this class in 2014 that 5 years from now I think everyone will be looking back as saying this was the stud of the class. And that is one draft thing for me that has come true. But Zach, I'm also the guy that was like, I think Cody Latimer is the best receiver in this class. So that, sometimes you got to take the good with the bad.
Right. Everyone has their hits and their misses. And the Broncos would do well to draft someone like Ed Oliver, but it's an extraordinarily deep defensive line class, and they can get talent elsewhere. I just think, based on my preferences, I would have to go a corner in that route. But what we both can deduce from this is sitting at pick number 10, the Broncos are guaranteed pretty much to land a blue chip prospect at a position of need. So they're sitting pretty. I think we can both agree on that.
Oh, yeah. Last thing I want to touch on in our conversation with Ben, and then we'll probably get out of here for today, is the fact that he is kind of echoing what I've been saying, what you've been saying on the podcast since the Combine, that Jarrett Stidham is the quarterback to watch for the Broncos beyond day one of the draft. So if things don't go exactly the way fans want in the top 10, or Drew Lock is off the board, Haskins is off the board when the Broncos go on the clock, watch for Jarrett Stidham. And I've heard from multiple places that Scangarello really likes him and took a shine to him. And he showed out well at the Combine, not only in his interviews from what I've been told, but especially on the field. He looked solid. He backed it up. And I think that the fact that his tape wasn't great at Auburn and his stats weren't exactly prolific as a quarterback in the SEC, I think a lot of that had to do with scheme and coaching, and I think the NFL believes, and a guy like Rich Scangarello believes, that they can glean more and net more, mine more out of Jarrett Stidham at the next level.
Yeah, this is a pre-draft riser. This is a prospect who's going to get his stock is going to improve before the draft. And from what I heard at the Combine, he might even sneak into the second round. And at that point, the Broncos don't take a QB in round 1. They like Stidham if he shows well in personal interviews and workouts in his pro day. I would have no problem pulling the trigger on him in that round. Someone like Devin White in the first, sit him in the second. You have Joe Flacco on the roster. You still leave your stuff available in the third, fourth, fifth, etc. I like him, though. In that second tier behind Locke and Haskins, I like Stidham at the top of that class. So if they can come out with him in the second or third round, I think they have to. That's the worst case scenario in this draft for Denver. In between round 1 and 3, they have to take a quarterback. I'm holding firm on that.
Should I tell the Haskins story on my flight back from Indy?
Do it. Let the world know.
So I'm at the airport waiting to jump on my flight out of Indianapolis. This is Sunday, late afternoon. And right as I'm about to hop on the plane, some obvious athletes walk up, and they're about to board too. And they end up boarding before me. I'm one of the great unwashed in cabin 3 waiting to jump on. So they board before me, and I hop on the plane. And as I'm walking down the aisle, and by this point, I'd already identified that one of them was, in fact, Dwayne Haskins. So I thought, oh, that's interesting, huh? Because my flight took me from, even though I was going west, I had a connection flight. So I actually went northeast for a minute for my connection. It took me to Detroit, and then my Detroit was a direct flight home. So he was on the same flight going to Detroit, and then he probably connected from there somewhere on his flight back. So anyway, I get on the plane. I'm walking down the aisle, and he's on an aisle seat inside, and he's on my right. I'm walking down, and as I pass him, he's looking down at his phone, watching highlights. And the highlights he was watching, you guys, okay, here's a little TMZ action for you, was none other than Oklahoma. So, Zach, do you think Homeboy was trying to figure out, what all the buzz and hype is on Kyler Murray? I would assume by now he's well aware after everything that took place in the Heisman running and, falling short to him in the Heisman vote. But he was watching Oklahoma tape. I saw it with my own eyes.
He must have saw Murray trending on Twitter after his press conference, wanting to check on some of the highlights. I don't know. It must have been maybe coincidental, but it's interesting that he's checking out the competition there.
Yeah, so anyway, great day of podcasting. Zach and I will be back tomorrow for the VIP mailbag. In the meantime, make sure you follow the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. Don't forget to do your part and leave a creative review. Give us a 5-star rating. Make sure you follow Benjamin Allbright on Twitter as well, at AlbrightNFL. That's 2 L's for those of you who aren't sure. Zach on Twitter, at Kelberman247. Myself, at Chad N. Jensen. Be good, you guys. We'll be back tomorrow for the VIP mailbag.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.